So I want to take the opportunity today to discuss some stuff of interest in regard to the Old Testament. And I'm going to read this passage out of the book of Daniel. And I think that the importance of it will become very, very clear once we read through this. Basically, it says, this is Daniel chapter 8. In the third year, the king of Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one I had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with two horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west, the north, and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the two-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its two horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power the large horn was broken off. In its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward a beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens and threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of sanctuary, the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." And he said to me, "It'll take 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." So it also gives the interpretation. So very interesting interpretation, and we'll begin. While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice calling from Ulai, calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." By the way, I have a hard time reading this because this is the NIV version, and I'm so used to a different version, but this is an easy one to read. Anyways, as he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, "Understand the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. The large horn between its eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replace the one that was broken off represents 4 kings that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of the reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation, will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many, and take his stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evening and the mornings that have been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out, and I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. So this is an interesting thing, and what a lot of people don't realize is that the book of Daniel is prophetic. Now, if you're a non-believer, you're automatically going to dismiss that. So, and you're going to dismiss it on the basis that prophecies do not really exist. Well, let's look at a couple things. This is the book of Daniel, chapter 8. There is a well-written out article. This is done by a Mark. I'm not sure if this is Hogwat. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. And what's interesting is he has got a link, and we'll try to remember to put this into the description of the video I'm putting together. And he actually goes through this very, very well. Basically, the only reason to dismiss prophecy is that it's impossible. That's the only reason to dismiss it. And then you can basically argue that it's impossible, and therefore you can come up with any number of reasons why you don't agree with said prophecy. So, whenever you look in here, you find a lot of different things. And if you ever do any historical evaluations, historical contextualization of different things, you have to look at stuff. For instance, there are loan words within the writing. There's a lot of different things that you can begin to look at to try to understand. And this man, I tell you what, this is a gold mine of information, and it is well put together. I'm going to focus on one specific section, though. It'll take me just a moment. Oh, by the way, just to point this out, this talks about the early texts of Daniel. Qumran, the Qumran text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, put it into the mid 150s, if I remember correctly, on its dating, but those are, of course, copies. Here you have this. This is begun in 260, and you get the idea. It goes a little further back. But what I want to show is an interesting story. It comes to us from Josephus. Now, if you're not familiar with Josephus, he is the predominant author regarding the Jewish histories, and he wrote the book Antiquities, and he wrote a couple of other works as well. And what's interesting about Josephus is that he is the predominant source for much of the material of the early Jewish state, specifically targeting the destruction of the temple under Vespasian, and of course Vespasian's son Titus, who Vespasian became emperor, and Titus basically came back to finish his work. And so what you find is that Josephus is an accepted historical source, and he tells us this story. He says, Josephus, first and foremost, he informs that the canon was closed at the reign of Artaxerxes. If you look at Artaxerxes, he is aged into the 400s BC, and so you're talking about Josephus, who is a primary accepted source, telling us it was already completed 400 years before Christ was born, plus. Then furthermore, he has this interesting story, the story of Alexander the Great. Josephus records a story of Alexander the Great when he was in the land of Israel in roughly 330 BC. He, as the story goes, was met by the high priest coming out of Jerusalem, who showed him a copy of the book of Daniel, wherein his reign and victory was foretold, and for this reason didn't sack Jerusalem, but instead provided special privileges to the city and priesthood. In Russia today, there is a tradition in Jewish families of naming their third son after Alexander, after the kindness Alexander showed to Jerusalem. Story is placed after Alexander swept down the Mediterranean coast, sacking cities as he went, culminating the attack on Egypt. From Egypt, he went up through Israel to Jerusalem, where the story picks up. Next, according to Josephus, he marched to Samaria. Then, according to history, he went off to attack the Persians, whom he utterly defeated against great odds. Clearly, if the story is true, the book of Daniel must be dated earlier than 330 BC. As of the present, the story is not independently verifiable. At very least, it shows Josephus' view of the date for the writing of the book as being early. It is not likely that Josephus completely fabricated the story. He must have had at least some sort of oral legend upon which it was based. The very existence of the story provides some weight on side of an early date. So what you find is that there is a historical, although not independently verifiable, story that existed prior to Josephus being born, which is in the time period of Christ, so 300 years after Alexander, where this event took place. Now, what's interesting to me is this. If you know much about Alexander the Great, there are no surviving copies of historical letters during his life, period. Yet we teach him in our schools as a historical character. Whenever you look at the life of Christ, you have to recognize that within 50 to 60 years after his death, burial, and resurrection, the whole of the New Testament is written. with the exception possibly of the book of Revelation. And I would say within 60 years it was probably written as well. I believe most people place it roughly in 90 AD, so Christ died roughly 30 AD, so about 60 years. Because it was written, if I remember correctly, the only way to actually date the book of Revelation is there's one man named Antipas who was martyred under, I want to say either it was Diocletian or Domitian. I believe it was Emperor Domitian. Emperor Domitian. Yeah, if I could ever spell or type. Emperor Domitian, yeah, it was in 81 to 96. So it gives you a rough idea. Anyways, Antipas was martyred under Domitian, which places the book of Revelation sometime in the 80s to 90s. And I think most people date it right around about 90. What's interesting, though, is this. Alexander the Great is taught in school as a historical character. Nothing was written about his life until some hundreds of years later. And in fact, we have nothing surviving with the exception of one writing that pops up sometime around 300-400 years after his life, and it's citing some other source material that has been lost to history. But yet, once again, we teach him as a historical fact. Of course, Christ, we don't teach a historical fact. We question him because obviously great and miraculous things can't happen. Or can they? Because here's the thing. If you go through this entire outline of this work that this man has done, you come down to a very, very interesting conclusion, and that is this. The only reason to demand to exclude the book of Daniel being prophetic is by saying prophecies don't exist. That's it. That's the only argument. I'm going to read this man's conclusion. It says, the Aramaic demands, and the Hebrew indicates a date before the 2nd century BC, and most likely in the late 6th or 5th century. The Persian and Akkadian foreign loanwords point to an early date, as do even the Greek loanwords. As all the evidence I examine either directly indicates, points to, or allows for the book to have been written in its final form in the reign of Cyrus the Great. The only thing that seems to contradict this dating is a theory that predictive prophecy cannot happen. In other words, every bit of information here, all of the evidence, points toward this having been done during the time period of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great, of course, let's see, lived in the 500s BC. So basically, the only people who can say, the only evidence that they can provide is just simply saying, that can't happen. Wow. Talk about taking your ball and going home because you don't want to play. Were it not for the predisposition against predictive prophecy in general, most scholars would be much more willing to concede that the evidence clearly points to, namely, a late 6th or early 5th century origin for the book. To say that one cannot know future events before they happen or a spiritual realm does not exist based merely on personal prejudice is simply unscientific. Science observes what has happened and draws a conclusion based on information. It is unscientific to close one's eyes to certain data due to prejudice against it. There has been discussed above much internal and external evidence that points to a 6th century date for the book of Daniel. It should be obvious that to change a view has been consistently held by an overwhelming majority of scholars, historians, religious leaders, and historical witnesses for a period spanning 2,000 years. One must bring to light some very solid evidence. The proponents of the Maccabean date have failed to do so. So what this means, the Maccabeans, of course, is about 150 BC, and the people who are simply saying, well, it had to have been during this time period to be able to allow this to all take place, are ignoring the fact that historically it has always been considered to have been written some 600 years before the life of the Christ. Well, 500 to 600 years before the life of Christ. And so there's got to be solid evidence, and there is no solid evidence. And I know scientific people, and they like to have evidence, but whenever your position is basically a lack of evidence, that's not scientific. So what you have here is in the book of Daniel, something written some 500-600 years before the event. And what's amazing, by the way, just to point out something, it describes the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. They didn't wear a diadem. They actually wore a, I want to say it was a ram's head, if I remember correctly. Yeah, a two-horned ram. They actually wore a ram's head for their crown, if you would. So the dating of the book of Daniel is very, very important because I think that's pretty obvious why. Because if you could actually have something predictive and that accurate, I mean, look at this and think about what it's saying. It's talking about the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians. And then it talks about how this next one would come up, and it would come and basically destroy that original one, this goat with a prominent horn between its eyes, coming from the west, which, if you're in Israel, the west would be Greece or Rome, and coming obviously in a very, very quick and rapid advance, striking the two-horned ram, which is the Medes and the Persians, and destroying it. That is shocking. And it's also important to note in verse 8 here, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. Alexander the Great died at what, age 28, 29 years old? Wasn't even 30 years old, and he dies during the middle of this great campaign. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. 4 prominent horns, basically, that's the 4 divisions of his nation, most notably with the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. This is history written before history took place. Thanks for tuning in.